Dawn, September 17th, 1862. A silver mist, thick and spectral, clings tenaciously to the rolling hills of western Maryland, settling in the valleys carved by the meandering Antietam Creek, a shallow, placid stream whose name would soon be etched into the annals of unparalleled carnage. The landscape is a picture of pastoral tranquility. Ripening cornfields stand tall and proud in the Miller and Poffenberger farms. Woodlots like the east and west woods are dense, shadowy and foreboding, and farmhouses dot the terrain, their whitewashed walls glowing faintly in the pre-dawn gloom like tombstones in a vast sleeping cemetery. But this serenity is a profound and utter lie. The very air is charged with a palpable, suffocating tension, heavy not just with the autumn moisture, but with the collective breath, fear, and resolve of over 120,000 men waiting for the storm to break, their fates and that of a fractured nation hanging in the balance. On the eastern banks of the creek, the Army of the Potomac, a vast blue host of volunteers and conscripts from every corner of the loyal states, stirs in its bivouacs. Its commander, the young, brilliant, perpetually overcautious and tragically hesitant General George Brinton McClellan, holds in his possession what amounts to a miraculous gift from the gods of war, a lost copy of Robert E. Lee's Special Orders, No. 191, found wrapped around 3 cigars, detailing the Confederate Army's precise movements and its dangerously scattered disposition. He knows Lee has divided his forces, sending Jackson to capture Harper's Ferry. He knows he holds the advantage, that he can destroy the pieces of the Southern Army one by one. And yet, a profound caution, a paralyzing fear of the phantom legions his intelligence reports consistently inflate, grips his spirit, stifling the aggressive instinct necessary for a decisive victory. Across the creek, the audacious Army of Northern Virginia, a hardened, lean force under the command of the revered and strategically daring Robert E. Lee, is cornered, its back to the Potomac River. Lee, defying all conventional military wisdom, has chosen to stand and fight on this precarious ground, betting his army and the Confederacy's future on the unmatched spirit of his men, their faith in his leadership, and the well-documented failings of his opponent. The stage is set not for a mere battle, but for a cataclysm that will redefine the very meaning of the American experiment, a day of reckoning for the young republic. This was no longer a war to restore the Union. As it was a struggle for its soul, a final, violent argument over the nation's founding contradiction of liberty and bondage, waiting to be resolved on the bloody altar of these Maryland fields. What seemed like a divine intervention, that lost order wrapped around 3 cigars, became, through a tragic alchemy of personality and command, the very source of Union paralysis. McClellan, the master organizer, the young Napoleon who could build, train, and inspire a magnificent army, but seemed psychologically incapable of risking it in a final, all-or-nothing gamble, saw the document not as a key to swift, annihilating victory, but as a potential trap laid by the wily Lee. He wasted 16 precious, irreplaceable hours believing he needed to perfect his plan, to reconnoiter, to prepare for every conceivable Confederate countermove. This delay, this fatal pause in the relentless tempo of war, allowed Lee precious time to frantically concentrate his forces, pulling together the commands of Jackson, Longstreet, and Hill around the village of Sharpsburg, transforming a potential death trap into a tenuous but cohesive defensive line. The tactical reality that would govern the coming day was a brutal anachronism, a chasm between technology and doctrine. The infantryman, the common soldier in blue and grey, now carried the .58 caliber Springfield or .577 Enfield rifled musket, a weapon with lethal accuracy out to 500 yards, a revolutionary advancement that had rendered the tactics of the Napoleonic era, with their dense columns and close-order volleys, utterly obsolete. Yet the generals on both sides, educated on the doctrines of Jomini and the legends of Wellington, still commanded as if they were fighting with smoothbore muskets, effective only to 80 yards. They ordered dense lines of men to advance across open ground in neat, orderly formations, perfect targets for the devastating cone of fire unleashed by defenders lying behind fences, in woodlots, or in sunken lanes. This was the great, tragic disconnect of the Civil War technology had revolutionized killing, creating a zone of death hundreds of yards deep. But military doctrine had failed to keep pace, clinging to a romanticized vision of battle that multiplied casualties to an industrial scale. McClellan's plan for September 17th was a reflection of this old-world thinking, a series of sequential, uncoordinated sledgehammer blows from north to south, first against Lee's left flank in the cornfield and east woods, then his center at the sunken road, and finally his right flank at the Burnside Bridge. It was a strategy of brute force and attrition, lacking subtlety, coordination, or any element of surprise, a plan that played directly into the hands of a defensive master like Lee, who could use his interior lines to shift his outnumbered forces to meet each crisis as it arose, fighting a battle of reaction and local counterattacks. The first act of the tragedy erupted in the pre-dawn chill of the Miller cornfield, a patch of land barely 400 yards deep and 250 yards wide, a perfectly contained arena for slaughter. As the first rays of sun pierced the mist, they illuminated a scene of surreal, almost biblical horror. The men of the Union Corps, under the pugnacious and ambitious General Joseph "Fighting Joe" Hooker, advanced into the towering corn, the stalks so high they obscured everything beyond a few feet, creating a disorienting, claustrophobic green maze. The air, once filled with the rustle of nature and the chirping of crickets, was suddenly torn apart by the ripping sound of canister shot from Confederate artillery positioned on the Nicodemus Heights to the west, each round transforming into a cloud of deadly iron pellets that scythed through the corn and the men within it. Then came the musketry, a sound like 1,000 sheets of canvas being ripped simultaneously. The fighting was not linear, but a series of close-range, visceral encounters in a labyrinth of green, where units lost cohesion and battles devolved into a chaotic melee of regimental and company-level actions. Brigades marched in, their flags flying proudly, deployed into line, and fired a volley into the thick, acrid smoke, only to be met by a storm of lead from Confederate infantry from the divisions of Hood and Lawton, hidden in the far tree line of the West Woods. The cornfield became a perfect, nightmarish killing zone. The corn was systematically shredded, cut down as if by 1,000 invisible scythes, revealing a carpet of blue and grey-clad bodies, twisted in the agonizing postures of sudden death. Here, legendary units etched their names into history with their blood. The Iron Brigade, those Westerners from Wisconsin and Michigan in their distinctive black hardy hats, advanced with grim determination, trading volley for volley at point-blank range with the Louisiana Tigers, a regiment known for its ferocity and Zouave-inspired uniforms, in a fight so intense that neither side could gain a lasting advantage. Men fought with bayonets and clubbed muskets when there was no time to reload, the conflict descending to its most primal level. The cornfield changed hands 15 times in 4 hours of uninterrupted slaughter, a piece of real estate of no intrinsic value, whose symbolic and tactical worth was paid for in lives. It was a maelstrom where individual courage was rendered meaningless by the impersonal industrial efficiency of massed rifle fire. A soldier later recalled that it was not a battle, but a great slaughtering, a place where every stalk of corn in the northern and greater part of the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and the dead lay so thick that one could walk across the field without stepping on the ground. But what appeared to the men choking on smoke and stumbling over corpses in the corn as a bloody, indecisive stalemate was, from a strategic vantage point, a crucible of fire that was testing the Army of Northern Virginia to its absolute limit. The sheer, unrelenting pressure applied by the Union Emancipation Corps, despite their catastrophic losses, was preventing Lee from ever seizing the initiative. He was forced into a desperate game of tactical chess, shuttling brigades from his right to his crumbling left like a fireman battling a blaze on multiple fronts. His army stretched to the breaking point. The command structure of the Confederacy was pushed to the brink. Stonewall Jackson, the stoic Presbyterian warrior, personally directed artillery placements and fed his last reserves into the fight, while James Longstreet, the steady old warhorse, oversaw the center with a calm demeanor that belied the imminent collapse of his lines. The technological superiority of the rifled musket was, in these defensive actions, the Confederacy's salvation, allowing their outnumbered infantry, often positioned behind cover, to inflict disproportionate and horrifying casualties on the attacking Union lines as they advanced across open ground. Yet for every Union brigade that broke and fell back, shattered and bleeding, another fresh one was fed into the grinder from McClellan's vast reserves, a testament to the Union's overwhelming advantage in manpower. The focal point of this immense pressure was now shifting, the battle's terrible center of gravity moving from the northern woodlots and the shattered corn to the very heart of the Confederate line, to a humble sunken farm lane that would, before the day was out, earn a new and grisly name that would echo through history as a byword for senseless slaughter. As the morning's fury in the cornfield and the west woods subsided into an exhausted, bloody stalemate, a deceptive lull fell over the northern part of the battlefield. The air, thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sulphurous stench of burnt powder, was punctuated not by musketry, but by the agonized, universal cries of the wounded left between the lines, pleading for water and help that would not come for days. It was during this eerie, haunting quiet that the Union High Command turned its gaze to the center, seeking a decisive breakthrough. There, bisecting the Roulette and Piper farms, lay a dilapidated farm lane, worn 4 feet deep in places by decades of wagon wheels and erosion. For the Confederate division of the acerbic and capable General D.H. Hill, this sunken road was a ready-made trench, a natural fortification that seemed a gift from Providence, a geological bulwark against the blue tide. They packed the lane, their lines 2 and 3 deep, their rifles resting on the parapet of earth at the lane's edge, creating a continuous, sheltered firing position. To the Union soldiers of General William H. French's and later Israel B. Richardson's divisions, advancing in successive waves across open, rolling fields of clover and pasture, the lane was an almost invisible threat, a mere fold in the earth. They marched forward, their colourful regimental flags a stark, brave contrast to the smoky, dun-coloured landscape, until they reached a crest barely 100 yards from the lane. Then, in an instant, the world exploded. A single, shattering volley erupted from the sunken road, a continuous sheet of flame and lead that swept the field like a scythe, a physical force that struck men down in rows. The first Union line simply dissolved into a tangle of dead and writhing wounded. The following lines, blinded by smoke and deafened by noise, wavered, advanced with desperate courage, and were cut down in turn. For 2 terrible hours, the pattern repeated with the grim, horrifying regularity of a metronome, a brave, orderly advance, a cataclysmic volley, and a bloody, disorganized retreat, the field becoming littered with the fallen in a grotesque, orderly sequence. The sunken road was living up to its defensive promise, a seemingly impregnable barrier where Southern marksmanship was proving its deadly worth, holding the center against overwhelming odds. Then, in the chaos and fog of war, a single critical flaw in the Confederate position was discovered, a kink in the lane's trajectory that would prove fatal. The sunken road was not straight, it zigzagged, forming a slight salient, and at this point, the right flank of the Confederate formation, belonging to General Williams' brigade, was exposed, jutting out into the field. A fresh Union brigade, under the command of the fiery, ambitious Colonel Francis Barlow, a young officer of exceptional talent, recognized the opportunity with a tactician's eye. Instead of advancing frontally into the slaughter, his men secured a position on a slight knuckle of land to the south that allowed them to look directly down the length of the sunken lane, enfilading the entire Confederate line. What happened next was not a battle, but an execution, a textbook demonstration of the deadliest form of fire on a Napoleonic-era battlefield. The Union infantry from the 61st and 64th New York began pouring a devastating, enfilading, fire-raking shots that traveled the entire length of the Confederate line, where every bullet could find a target. The lane that had been a sanctuary became a slaughterhouse in minutes. Trapped in the depression, unable to see their assailants or effectively return fire, entire regiments were annihilated where they stood. The orderly volleys disintegrated into a panicked, chaotic scramble as men from Rhodes and Anderson's brigades tried to claw their way up the muddy banks to escape the deadly funnel, only to be shot down by their own comrades in the rear who were still facing forward, unaware of the disaster unfolding beside them. In less than 30 minutes, the sunken road was filled with Confederate dead and wounded, piled upon one another in a ghastly heap, 2 and 3 bodies deep. A witness described it as a road of blood, so thick with corpses that one could walk its length without touching the ground. This was Bloody Lane. This was the moment, the hinge of fate upon which the entire war turned. The center of Lee's army was shattered, broken wide open, with no reserves left to plug the gap. A coordinated, powerful thrust by the vast Union reserves, the fresh and eager V Corps, held in the rear, could have split the Confederate army in 2, driven it into the Potomac, and ended the rebellion in a single, decisive afternoon. The path to victory, paid for with a river of blood, now lay utterly exposed and undefended, a mile-wide hole in the Confederate center leading directly to Sharpsburg and Lee's only line of retreat. But what seemed like certain war-ending victory was squandered by the very caution that had defined the Union command from its highest level, a failure of nerve that would prolong the war for 2.5 more years and cost hundreds of thousands more lives. From his headquarters, 1.5 miles from the front at the Philip Pry House, General McClellan, the self-styled young Napoleon, received reports of the breakthrough. Yet, gripped by what his critics would call the slows, he refused to commit his massive reserve, the fresh and untouched V Corps under Fitz-John Porter, over 20,000 strong. He was convinced, against all evidence and the desperate pleas of his subordinates on the ground, that Lee was holding vast reserves of his own, the phantom commands of Longstreet that were in fact already fully engaged and decimated, poised for a cataclysmic counterstroke. The spectre of the always larger enemy army, a psychological phantom that lived only in McClellan's mind, held the entire Union army in check at its moment of supreme opportunity. On the ground, the Union troops who had cracked the Bloody Lane were exhausted, leaderless and traumatized, their own formations shattered by the cost of their success. General Israel Richardson, aggressive and effective division commander, was mortally wounded by a stray shell while trying to reorganize his men for a further advance, a loss that further crippled the Union momentum. The order for a general advance, for the final war-winning push, never came. For over 2 hours, a strange, surreal quiet fell over the center of the battlefield, a silence broken only by the pitiful moans of the thousands of wounded men from both sides, lying intermingled in the sunken road and the fields beyond, a haunting chorus to the failure of command. This precious, unforgivable pause was all the time Robert E. Lee needed to perform a miracle of battlefield triage. With his center in ruins, he personally directed the cobbling together of a new, desperate defensive line on the heights behind the lane, rallying stragglers, gathering scattered artillery batteries, and forming a thin but determined barrier with the remnants of his army. The single greatest opportunity to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, a chance that would not come again until the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse nearly 3 years later, evaporated in the hazy Maryland afternoon, sacrificed on the altar of one man's catastrophic indecision and lack of moral courage. The final tragic act of the drama now shifted to the southern end of the field, to a picturesque 3-arched stone bridge that spanned the Antietam Creek, a place of quiet beauty destined to become another symbol of futile sacrifice. Here, General Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, some 12,000 men, was tasked with crossing the creek, turning Lee's right flank, and cutting off his retreat to the Potomac at Boteler's Ford. It should have been a straightforward, if difficult, operation, but the bridge, later to bear Burnside's name in infamy, was a natural choke point. The creek here was deep, its banks steep and muddy, and on the western bluff, a few hundred Georgia sharpshooters under the command of General Robert Toombs, a politician, turned general, desperate for martial glory, were dug in behind trees and rocks, their rifles commanding a perfect, unobstructed field of fire over the bridge and its approaches. What followed was a 3-hour spectacle of tactical inflexibility that bordered on criminal incompetence. Burnside, fixated on the bridge itself as the objective rather than the crossing of the creek, ordered wave after wave of Union troops in direct frontal assaults across the narrow 125-foot span, The result was a horrific one-sided massacre. The Union soldiers, funneled into the killing zone, were shot down in heaps by the accurate and deliberate fire from the protected, elevated Confederate position. The creek, shallow and easily fordable in multiple places just a few hundred yards downstream, was ignored for hours. A catastrophic failure of initiative, reconnaissance, and basic common sense that cost thousands of casualties. The bridge became a symbol of the day's futile sacrifice, a place where the raw courage of the Union soldier was utterly wasted on a fatally flawed and stubbornly executed plan. Finally, after suffering staggering losses and belatedly discovering the downstream fords, elements of the 51st New York and 51st Pennsylvania managed to flank the Georgian position, storming the heights and finally securing the western bank. It was now late afternoon, the precious hours of daylight squandered. The delay had been catastrophic, but Burnside's corps, finally unleashed, began to push inland, driving the thin, exhausted Confederate right flank, held by the division of David R. Jones, back towards the streets of Sharpsburg itself, threatening to collapse the entire southern line. The Union advance toward the final, decisive blow now gained irresistible momentum, pushing the Confederates back through the fields and orchards south of Sharpsburg. The Confederate right flank, held by a skeleton force that had been stripped to reinforce the crumbling left and center, crumbled under the weight of Burnside's numerical superiority. The high ground near the town became the last defensible position. Lee's army, battered and bleeding from 1,000 wounds, its organization in tatters, was on the verge of total, irreversible collapse. Its back was to the Potomac, with only a single vulnerable ford at Boatler's as a potential escape route. Victory, the complete and absolute victory that had eluded the Union for so long, the victory that would have justified the terrible price of the cornfield and bloody lane, was now merely moments away. The entire weight of the Ninth Corps was poised to crash into Sharpsburg, capture the Confederate supply trains, and seal the fate of the Confederacy by capturing its most famous army. But then, as the sun began to cast long, dramatic shadows across the field, painting the scene in a grotesque, beautiful light, a new column of troops appeared on the Hagerstown Road to the south, raising a plume of dust that was visible for miles. A collective, chilling dread fell over the advancing Union soldiers and their commanders. Was this the vanguard of Stonewall Jackson's corps, arriving from Harper's Ferry in the nick of time to seal their doom? The very fear that had paralyzed McClellan all day, the specter of Confederate reinforcements, now seemed to be materializing on the battlefield in a tangible, terrifying form, halting the Union advance as officers hesitated, unsure of the new threat. What seemed like the arrival of a fresh Confederate army was, in fact, the last of Lee's scattered forces, the famed Light Division of General A.P. Hill. Having marched 17 grueling miles from Harper's Ferry, driven by the sound of the distant battle, Hill's men, their distinctive red shirts stained with sweat and dust, arrived not as a rested, orderly reserve, but as a desperate, breathless and strung-out mob. They did not form neat lines of battle, they slammed directly into the exposed, open flank of Burnside's advancing corps in a ragged but furious piecemeal assault. The shock was immense and psychologically devastating. The Union troops, who had been on the cusp of total victory, their morale soaring, were thrown into confusion and panic. Their formations, aimed at Sharpsburg, were not prepared for a violent attack from the side. The momentum of the entire assault on the right flank halted, wavered, and then began to reverse under the desperate, frenzied pressure of Hill's exhausted but determined men. Burnside, his confidence shattered, sent frantic messages back to McClellan pleading for the reinforcements that had been available all day, Porter's 5 Corps, or even a single division. None would come. McClellan, still convinced he was facing overwhelming numbers and that his own army was on the brink of disaster, refused to commit a single man from his vast reserve of 20,000 fresh troops, the final damning act of his command failure. The battle, which had raged with unremitting fury for over 12 hours, sputtered to a bloody, inconclusive end as darkness finally fell, mercifully cloaking the horror. The thunder of cannon and the rattle of musketry were replaced by a far more terrible sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives: the pitiful, universal, and ceaseless cries of the more than 23,000 killed, wounded, and missing men who littered the landscape, a single day's harvest of suffering. The single bloodiest day in American history was over. The fields of Antietam were a horrifying spectacle, a testament to the destructive power of modern war and the tragic fallibility of human command. Where courage was abundant, but decisive leadership was fatally absent. But what appeared on the surface as a tactical draw, a stunningly squandered opportunity that left the two armies still locked in a deadly embrace, was in the grand calculus of history the strategic victory that the Union and President Abraham Lincoln so desperately needed. Robert E. Lee's first and most ambitious invasion of the North, designed to win foreign recognition and demoralize the Northern public, had been stopped cold and turned back. The aura of Confederate invincibility, born on the battlefields of Manassas and sustained during the 7 days on the peninsula, was irrevocably broken. The Army of Northern Virginia, though not destroyed, was crippled, having suffered catastrophic casualties it could never hope to replace, and was forced to retreat, humbled, back across the Potomac into Virginia, its campaign a failure. This was the catalyst, the crucial moment of political leverage that Abraham Lincoln had been waiting for, a victory, however ambiguous, to hang a proclamation upon. For months, he had held in his desk a document that would redefine the very purpose of the war, a proclamation declaring all slaves in rebel-held territory to be forever free. His cabinet had advised him to wait for a military victory to announce it, lest it be seen as the desperate last gasp of a losing power, an act of malice. The Union victory at Antietam, however marginal and unsatisfying from a military perspective, provided that crucial, indispensable momentum. It was the sign from the heavens, the manifestation of shifting fortunes that he needed to act from a position of strength. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, surrounded by his cabinet, Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, giving the Confederate States 100 days to return to the Union or face the permanent loss of their enslaved property. With a stroke of his pen, the character of the war was transformed forever. It was no longer just a constitutional struggle to preserve the Union, it was now a moral crusade for human freedom, a war for the soul of America, a second American Revolution. This single, monumental act changed the fundamental calculus of the conflict. It instantly recast the struggle in the eyes of the world, making it politically impossible for Great Britain and France, nations that had long since abolished slavery and where public opinion was firmly abolitionist, to grant diplomatic recognition and material aid to the Confederate States. More profoundly, it opened the door for the enlistment of black soldiers, who would go on to fill the ranks of the United States colored troops with immense courage and determination, comprising nearly 10% of the Union Army by war's end and proving instrumental to its ultimate victory, transforming a war for union into a war of liberation in the most practical sense. The Battle of Antietam, therefore, was not merely the bloodiest single day in American history, it was the most consequential turning point of the entire war. It was the battle that gave Abraham Lincoln the political power and the moral authority to change America forever, to begin the process of redeeming the Republic's founding promise. The quiet creek named Antietam would henceforth be remembered not for its gentle waters, but for the blood of thousands that soaked its banks, the blood that ultimately paved the way for a new birth of freedom, ensuring that a government conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal would not perish from the earth, but would be reborn, purified in a fiery trial of its own making, into a more enduring union, one step closer to realizing its founding ideals.